The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. For those of you who served on council during Steve Matthias's last year, the text for today, the gospel text, should be somewhat familiar. Steve used that text as a way to be provocative, to get us on council to maybe think about how we could do ministry a little bit differently here at First Congregational Church. And what he intended to do was to provoke a conversation around that. Well, it actually didn't go very far because, quite frankly, the model of ministry that is proposed in this text is very different from the model of ministry that we use here at First Congregational Church. Just go as far as the first sort of admonition. Don't take anything with you, Jesus says to his disciples. And, well, we've got a lot of stuff. We've got a building. We have so much stuff in the building. We have a budget to make sure that we take care of our stuff. And even during this time of pandemic, the budget has continued because we kind of need to maintain our stuff. The reality is these two models are very different. But in actual fact, the model that is rolled out by Jesus in Luke is very, very similar to what we see with the Apostle Paul and how he describes his ministry. Paul went from town to town founding churches. He did not depend on the churches in the cities he was founding at that time for his livelihood. He largely depended on donations from churches he already had founded, who were vested in his ministry and wanted to support him as he founded other churches. And he also had sort of a part-time job as a tent maker, so he was sort of able to be self-supporting and self-sufficient. In fact, he, in some of his epistles, boasts about his ability not to draw on the resources of the congregation in the town in which he is visiting. And because of this situation, the churches in Paul's time did not have their own church buildings. They often met in the villa of one of the wealthier members of the congregation. And this was actually kind of disguised by the cultural norms of the time. Rich people were often looked on as patrons, and they had clients who were people of less means. And daily, wealthy people would open their villa to their clients to come in, and they would exchange favors. They would ask the patron to do something for them, and the patron would ask something kind of in return, sort of a mutual favor giving, but the patron was in control. So when early Christians met early in the morning for worship, they would all congregate at a villa, and it would look like just an ordinary round of patronage. So the church was able to hide in plain sight, even though it was kind of an underground organization. But being an underground organization, it had a lot of missionary fervor and a lot of zeal to it. And that persisted through the first couple of centuries and was even sort of ramped up a bit by periodic persecution. Only rarely, I think, under Diocletian was persecution even near empire-wide, and only very briefly. But persecutions would be sporadic and they would be intense. And so the church had an attitude of revering its martyrs. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of martyrology stories of the lives of martyrs that the church collected as its heroes. And then everything changed. Outside of the church, there were other social dynamics at play. During the reign of Marcus Aurelius, who is early in the 3rd century, the Empire of Rome reached as large as it was going to get. It actually encompassed, at the time, 1/4 of the world's population. And it stretched from the Atlantic all the way up into what is now England, all the way across Western Europe and Southern Eastern Europe, into what is now the Middle East, to Iraq, to the Tigris and the Euphrates. It went south into Africa. It was vast. It encompassed many different languages and cultures, and so was unwieldy. And a political solution was found to sort of cut the empire in half, at least between the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. And even that proved unwieldy, and so there was a further subdivision in each of the halves of the empire, cleaving them in half again. And at the head of each quarter of the empire was a Caesar. Well, people got to be Caesar by naked ambition. And when they got to that point with three other rivals, what do you think happened? Inevitably, one wanted it all. And so there was a series of constant civil wars between the Caesars to see who would have supreme control. The one who finally won in the end was Constantine, early in the 4th century. And he knew that when he had supreme power, there was no way he could go back to the old political model of sharing power between various Caesars. He had to find another way to hold the empire together. Turns out his mother was Christian. And so he knew some things about Christians that other previous emperors did not. He knew that they were not subversive radicals trying to overthrow the empire. He knew they were decent people, law-abiding, who meant good, and they existed in every corner of the empire. And so he decided that if he made Christianity the official religion of the empire, he would have that glue to hold everything together. And when he did that, everything changed for the church. All of a sudden, we're not in an era of house churches, but all the old pagan temples were converted into churches, and their lands and incomes given to the church, and the church became landed. Some of those temples, even in the city of Rome today, those ancient pagan temples, still serve as churches today. And if you go throughout Western Europe with many of the major large churches, dig under the foundation and you will find an old pagan temple, guaranteed. So what did that do for the church? All of a sudden, it didn't have to strive for discipleship. It was no longer missionary. There was nobody left to convert. Everybody was now Christian. And the whole mission of the church changed from missionary zeal to pastoral care. After all, there's nobody else left to convert. You just take care of the folks and make sure that they're good Roman citizens of the empire. And that idea of the church as sort of an arm of the state and an official religion lasted for about 1,000 years to the 14th century. And what happened in the 14th century? The Black Death. Now, we think between 30 to 60% of Europe died in that century due to the Black Death. That is a hugely traumatic event. We've had between 1 and 2%, we're approaching 2% of our population having died from COVID. And you can already see the insanity that is coming out in our society just for that 1.5 to 2%. Imagine 30 to 60% of the population being killed by a disease. The rest of the 14th century is filled with all sorts of bizarre kind of happenings and movements. And finally, in the 15th century, people are waking up and saying, we need to move on from this sort of system of government. And what folks began doing is they began noticing the old Roman ruins around them, at least around the Mediterranean, and noticing that the architecture was so much lighter, and so much more elegant than what they were building in the Middle Ages. And then the great hunt for knowledge was on. All these books of classical antiquity were secreted away in monasteries, and there was a great hunt to find these books and bring this ancient knowledge back out. And that began the Renaissance. It was a desire to sort of recreate classical antiquity, and politically things started changing as well. We saw the rise of independent city-states that were governed by city councils, and people in the cities voted for the councils instead of just serving a king or an emperor who is sort of absolute monarch. And the change started happening in the church as well. We see in the 15th century a number of Reformation movements that, like the secular movement of trying to recapture classical antiquity, had a similar movement of trying to recapture what they thought the New Testament church was like. The church was powerful enough in the 15th century to be able to squash many of those reform movements. But by the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th, that movement was inevitable, and the Protestant Reformation that was spurred by this Renaissance thought took off. And that profoundly changed the church. The Protestant church became, again, a missionary church full of the missionary zeal of the New Testament. But as we get into the second half of the 16th century with the wars of religion, the resolution of those wars basically said, okay, this part of Europe is going to be Catholic, this part of Europe is going to be Protestant. And amongst the Protestant parts of Europe, they said, well, you're going to be this kind of Protestant, you're going to be that kind of Protestant. And all of a sudden, the church as it was before the Reformation was recreated, where the church served the state. And no longer was there the missionary zeal that existed in the early part of the Reformation, but things reverted back to pastoral care. And we can see this in New England. Both Massachusetts and Connecticut were founded as congregationalist theocracies. You founded a town. When you founded a town, you immediately founded a congregational church. And where are those churches found? They're found on the village green. Our first two meeting houses were on the village green here in Ridgefield. If they're not on the village green, they're at the intersection of post roads. Well, it just so happens where our church right now is the intersection of two post roads. That heritage is with us. And we eventually woke up with the Enlightenment and dissolved the theocracy, allowed other denominations to plant churches in New England. But that sort of mentality of the church being sort of having pride of place in society and everybody is a Christian persisted through the 1960s until there was another social revolution and people sort of figured out, hey, I don't have to go to church. There's nothing that says I must. There's no one pushing me to anymore. We began then seeing a decline in membership. We saw that decline turn into a flood of people leaving the church after 9/11. And that wasn't just the church that went into crisis. All of our formal institutions across the board in the country were the subject of a severe lack of confidence. And so because the church has membership, we maybe saw it a little more than other institutions, but it was across the board. And what was our response? Well, we were going to double down on doing what we do even better. So I remember after 9/11, the kind of continuing education events I attended shifted. The church decided, you know, the way to beat this crisis is to make our ministers more competent. They need to become better managers. They need to engage in strategic planning. They need to understand staffing dynamics. And all those books in my library that cover those topics actually date from 2001 on in the last 20 years. Nothing from before. Well, that didn't work either. And along came our own pandemic. And we were forced out of our building and forced into exile. And we discovered, hey, we can still be the church. We can still do ministry outside of our building. We can still make an impact. We can still have fellowship. We can still grow as Christians. We can still proclaim the gospel. And so as we're looking at the tail end of this pandemic, and we are not there yet by any means, there is still a ways to go. I think we need to ask a couple of critical questions. As we go back into our buildings, are we going to go back into the same way of doing things as we did before? Or has the world changed around us? And that leads me back to our text. If you strip away our initial reaction to what Jesus is saying to his disciples and telling them to go without supplies, he is saying, go and be vulnerable. You remember what it's like when you're in a vulnerable situation. Your radar is up and you're looking 360 degrees around you. You know, you listen better. You pay attention more to what is going on around you. And that's what Jesus really wanted for his disciples, to go into a situation with their radar up, listening more than speaking to begin with. And there is an interesting reversal that happens when you do that. You know, in our ordinary circumstances, when we're in our sanctuary, we pride ourselves on our ability to welcome the stranger. We think that is a great skill and a great exercise of our hospitality, that when somebody who is strange comes among us, we roll out an extravagant welcome. But what Jesus is saying to his disciples is, no, when you go out, you're the stranger. You're the one who is in that position. And so we see this topsy-turvy role reversal that we see so much in the gospel here. And then bear in mind that Jesus is sending out the disciples to Samaria, where observant Jews are not welcome, where the customs are different. And he says, eat what is put in front of you. In other words, don't judge. Don't go in with your superior understanding of who you are or your superior ideas. Encounter people where they are and who they are and accept them for who they are. Be humble. Have some humility about you as you listen. And then he says, cure all those who ask for healing. In other words, be generous with the gifts that you have. And seek people of peace. And in seeking people of peace, bring peace to people. You know, when you think about it, that is not such a strange form of ministry. We do it every time we send folks out on a mission trip. We send them to a place where they are unfamiliar, where they have certain vulnerabilities. And yes, they go thinking that they're carrying all sorts of resources with them and are going to do good. Well, I have a friend back in Colorado who's been going on Habitat for Humanity builds internationally for 50 years. And he told me this once. He said, I used to go to change the world, but I kept on going because I found out those worlds I went to changed me and made me a better Christian. And that's what we do when we go on mission trips. We think we're going to go off and do good to some people, but we end up being received with incredible hospitality, and our eyes are open to how other people live, and they teach us things. And then we build a point of trust and confidence that they finally ask the question, why are you here? And that's the point that we're able to share the gospel. What we don't do is bring those folks back from the mission trip and say, okay, can you see this community of Ridgefield in the same way? Can you interact in the same way? Can you go out and be vulnerable, bring your gifts, share them, make a difference? And then when people ask you why you are doing that, say, it is because of what I believe and what my Lord Jesus Christ has done for me. There are a number of ways that we can reach out from our congregation in that way. Not using our building as the be-all and end-all where ministry has to happen, but maybe as base camp from which we go out in mission, from which we go out to seek those people of peace and bring them God's peace, from which we go out and align ourselves with other people who wish to do good and do good alongside of them to the point where they ask, why are you doing this? And then we share the gospel and hopefully invite them into a larger understanding of what we are about as a church. And so my prayer for us is that as we re-enter and reclaim our facilities, we don't just reclaim it for ourselves, but we use it as a resource for us, a springboard for us to get further out into the community in order to do God's will and witness to God's kingdom and bring God's peace to all.